Hello everyone, I am Felix from In Africa. In Africa is the African Youth Initiative for Sustainable Development, Self-Reliance and its Dignity. The letter I'm going to read today, 16th June 2025, addressed to our fellow young Africans and is copied to Secretary General of African Union, African Union Youth Envoy, Secretary General of South African Development Community, SADC, Secretary General of East African Community, EAC, the Secretary General of Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, Secretary General of Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, Secretary General of Economic Community of Central African States, ICECAS, the Secretary General of Arab Maghreb Union. It is talking about the African-shaped image into the problems on international level. Dear fellow African youth, we are writing to you today because Africa, our shared home, is often portrayed by the international media in a way that does not fully represent the truth of our situation or potential. As young Africans, it is important that we understand both how the world views our continent and the reality of the challenges we face. This letter seeks to remind you that the power to change the narrative lies within us. We must take responsibility for shaping our future and telling our own stories with honesty, unity, and purpose. It comprises of about 35 problems or points we have looked at, and now we are going to start by number one. Point number one, nuclear weapons. Africa must also consider establishing nuclear weapons or nuclear deterrence capability, whether through one country or multiple nations individually developing such a capability. This could serve as a strategic measure for protection of Africa. It would assert Africa's sovereignty and strengthen its defense capacity on global stage. Having nuclear weapons would ensure that Africa is not easily manipulated or undermined by foreign powers. This deterrence would allow African countries to enhance their position in international diplomacy, protecting their interests and securing a more independent future. Point number two, hunger in the stomach and the mind. Selfishness among Africans has led to focus only on physical hunger, neglecting intellectual growth. This mindset of self-satisfaction causes people to prioritize their own needs over those of their fellow Africans, resulting in stagnation not only in development but also in innovation and collective progress. The hunger of mind is just as dangerous as it prevents Africa from reaching its full potential. Point number three, non-progressive attitudes. Media portrayal. The media often highlights Africa's cultural heritage, focusing on traditional customs and practices. However, it tends to overlook the ways in which certain long-standing norms can obstruct progress, sidestepping discussion about these challenges in favor of a romanticized view of African traditions. In reality, Africa's development should embrace its cultural identity, but without adopting foreign practices that conflict with its values, such as homosexuality, which many African societies see as foreign imposition. Resistance to modernization often stems from the fear that adopting new ideas will erode traditional African values. However, true progress requires a balanced integration, innovation, and modernization while preserving African cultural integrity. Point number four, strong commitment to white people. Media portrayal. Africa's reliance on foreign aid and validation is framed as a necessary support. In reality, Africa's over-reliance on Western aid is a colonial legacy that inhabits true self-reliance fosters a dependence mindset. Point number five, being mobile, migration. Media portrayal. Migration is often described as a crisis, particularly focusing on Africa's move to Europe. without examining internal displacement or its root causes. In reality, migration within and outside Africa is driven by political instability, poor governance, and economic opportunities, resulting in a brain drain. Point number 6, greed in power. Media portrayal. African leadership is often portrayed as corrupt without providing a full context of how historical exploitation and weak institutions contribute to the corruption. In reality, corruption is systematic, influenced by both local and international actors, and undermines equitable development. Point number 7, poverty. Media portrayal. Poverty is often portrayed as a fundamental issue in Africa, with simplistic narratives about aid as the solution. In reality, poverty is linked to historical exploitation, mismanagement, and a skewed global economic system, where foreign powers and global organizations share responsibility. Point number 8, lack of sustainability. Media portrayal. Media rarely addresses Africa's environmental sustainability unless tied to climate change discussions. In reality, many African policies prioritize short-term gains over long-term sustainability, especially in the extraction of natural resources. Number 9. Brain starvation. Media portrayal. Africa's education crisis is often highlighted, but solutions are framed as external interventions like foreign scholarships. In reality, intellectual development is stifled due to underfunded education system, brain drain, and inadequate infrastructure, making Africa less competitive in global industries. Point 10. Fear loves free speech. Media portrayal. Political repression and free speech violations are frequently highlighted in specific cases. Reality? Fear of speaking out is widespread due to political repression, stifling creativity, civil society, and democratic development. Point number 11. Defeatist attitude. Media portrayal. Implicitly suggested through narrative that portray Africa as a continent needing foreign intervention. In reality, decades of exploitation, corruption, and poor governance has fostered a sense of hopelessness and powerlessness in many African societies. Point number 12. Unrealized projects. Media portrayal focuses on failed African projects without providing the broader context of funding challenges, political instability, or international barriers. In reality, many African projects fail due to lack of political will, funding, infrastructure, and sustainable policy, preventing potential transformative initiatives from succeeding. Point number 13. Power in hands of some personnel. Some individuals also in authority misuse their power outside of legal and ethical standards. This often serves personal interests rather than public goods, hindering progress, especially among the youth. Ideas that don't align with their influence are suppressed, and in some cases, corruption follows. Point number 14. Love of money over Africa. Media portrayal. Often portrayed as corruption and greed within African politics. In reality, the prioritization of wealth over the welfare of the population perpetuates corruption and underdevelopment, with leaders misappropriating public funds from personal enrichment. Point number 15. Compliance with external forces. Media portrayal. Africa's reliance on foreign aid and international bodies like the IMF is portrayed as a necessity for economic recovery. In reality, this compliance often undermines Africa's sovereignty, forces countries to adopt policies that benefit creditors rather than local economies. Point number 16, intermediation in governance, media portrayal. Frequently reported in terms of isolated cases of dictatorship or authoritarianism. In reality, intermediation and coercion in governance are widespread, preventing reforms and keeping power concentrated in the hands of few elites. Point number 17, remembering our history, media portrayal. African history is often framed through colonial lenses, with little attention given to pre-colonial achievements. In reality, a deeper understanding of Africa's history, including the damage caused by colonialism, is essential for shaping its future development and identity. Point number 18, struggle for democracy, media portrayal. African nations' struggle for democracy are often sensationalized, focusing on election violence or coups. In reality, the challenges are rooted in weak institutions, foreign interference, and international corruption, making the establishment of stable democracies difficult. Point number 19, election fraud, media portrayal. Election fraud in Africa is reported, but the coverage tends to focus on individual instances rather than the systematic nature of the problem. In reality, election fraud erodes trust in the governments and democracy, with manipulation often benefiting untreated elites and external interests. Point number 20, elites clinging to power, media portrayal. African elites are often portrayed as corrupt dictators with little emphasis on how foreign powers support and enable them with these regimes. In reality, the problem is systematic, with political elites using a democratic method to maintain control, often with external backing. Point number 21, plundering public property, media portrayal. Media often covers the misuse of public funds or assets, but focuses narrowly on specific leaders or cases. In reality, the plundering of public resources by political elites is a widespread problem, exacerbated by weak institutions and lack of accountability. Point number 22, too much talk, no action, media portrayal. The media often highlights the Africa's grand political promises that fail to materialize in reality. This issue is deeply embedded in African governance, where there is a culture of making promises without the political will or resources to follow through. Point number 23, exploitation of foreign powers, media portrayal. Africa's exploitation is often reduced competition between foreign powers for resources with little mention of local complicity. In reality, foreign corporations and governments exploit Africa's resources, often in collaboration with corrupt local elites, perpetuating underdevelopment. Point number 24, clan-based politics, media portrayal. This issue is often covered as ethnic conflicts or tribalism without addressing the political dynamics that perpetuate it. In reality, clan-based politics fuels inequality and division, concentrating power within specific families or groups and stalling national unity. Point number 25, conspiracies against development, media portrayal. Rarely discussed in media except in speculative reporting. In reality, internal and external conspiracies often manipulate African politics, including interference from foreign powers looking to secure economic or strategic advantages. Point number 26, governance for personal interests, Media portrayal. African governance is frequently portrayed as a corruption, with leaders working for personal gain rather than public goods. In reality, governments often claim to work for the public good but are more focused on maintaining power and personal wealth, leading to widespread of underdevelopment. Point number 27. National unity. Media portrayal. Ethnic and religious divisions in Africa are frequently reported to be rarely linked to the historical exploitation and legacies of colonialism. In reality, without transcending ethnic, religious, and political divisions, development and peace remain elusive. National unity is essential for progress. Point number 28. Food insecurity. Media portrayals. Africa's food insecurity is often highlighted during famines or droughts, but the structural causes are underreported. In reality, food insecurity stems from conflicts, climate change, and poor governance, which are compounded by global economic inequalities. Point number 29. Mismanagement of resources. Media portrayal. Often framed as a problem of local corruption without addressing the role of foreign corporations. In reality, Africa's vast resources are frequently mismanaged due to corruption, depriving the continent of sustainable development opportunities. Point number 30. Education deficit. Media portrayal. Africa's education problems are often reduced to lack of schools and teachers. In reality, the education deficit is a result of poor policies, lack of funding, and a global system that perpetuates unequal access to quality education. Point number 31. Healthcare deficiency. Media portrayal. African healthcare systems are often depicted as struggle or in crisis, especially during disease outbreaks like Ebola. In reality, healthcare deficiencies are linked to chronic underfunding, poor infrastructure, dependence on foreign aid. African leaders often seek medical care abroad, which underscores the failure to invest in the local health sector. Point number 32. Neglecting youth potential. Media portrayal. Media usually frames Africa's youth as either a burden due to unemployment or potential agents of change. In reality, Africa's youth, being the largest in the world, are underutilized resources. With proper investment in education, leadership opportunities, and entrepreneurship, they could transform the continent's future. Point number 33. Racism. Xenophobia among Africans. Media portrayal. African xenophobia, such as attacks on foreign nationals in South Africa, is covered as isolated violence without exploring the deeper social, economic, and political reasons. In reality, xenophobia is the result of colonial divisionism, where hostilities between different African ethnicities and nationalities are exacerbated by economic hardships and unemployment. Point number 34. Terrorism. Driven by foreign interests. Media portrayal. Terrorism in Africa is often framed as a domestic issue or a result of local extremist groups like Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab. In reality, terrorism in Africa is often linked to foreign powers seeking control of natural resources, as seen in interventions in places like Libya, the Sahel region, and Mozambique, driven by geopolitical interest rather than purely internal factors. Point number 35. June 16th, reclaiming the Day of the African Child. This is not a celebration, it is institutionalized discrimination. No other continent is told its children need a special day. Why? June 16 should honor the fallen youth of Soweto, not parade African children as helpless victims. This narrative of pity erases their deficiency and distorts their legacy. Reclaiming the day, Soweto's children were revolutionaries, not charity cases. Conclusively, the external influence on Africa, particularly through programs like Green Cards and other migration incentives, has created a mentality among many Africans, especially the youth, that life outside the continent offers better opportunities, which is a lie. This belief has driven countless Africans to pursue migration at great personal cost, often risking dangerous journeys across the Mediterranean Sea, referred to as the death toll of younger Africans. Even when they reach foreign lands such as America, they often face discrimination, violence, insecurity, and significant financial burdens. As a result, Africa continues to lose its younger talent, leading to a brain drain that stalls progress. The continent remains dependent on foreign powers and continues to struggle with internal issues like poverty and corruption and underdevelopment. Despite the potential within Africa, this cycle of migration and external manipulation prevents meaningful long-term development, leaving Africa stuck in the same challenges it has faced for decades. Moreover, Africa must explore ways to protect itself, including considering the development of nuclear weapons or the traces capabilities. We must also avoid adopting foreign practices that do not fit our unique cultures and societal structures, such as policies imposed without regarding of our context, including certain terms of governance or social norms. In building our future, it is essential that African democracy reflects the needs and aspirations of our people, considering our diverse cultures and community structures. We as youth must ignore these claimed themselves the world medias. Nothing they teach anyone about Africa. International Day of Children must remain one, and June 16th has to be a remembrance to Soweto children. It is also critical for African youth to be included at the table of decision makers, as they are the ones who will carry the torch of change, leading Africa toward a self-reliant and a dignified future. This was a letter written to our fellow young Africans. We are showing African-shaped image into the problems on international level. These gathered points will help African youth to reframe our future and the future of our continent. Thank you so much.